Thank you. And I put a title on here, Post-Disaster Recovery Plans, Types and Purposes. You may not have known that there was more than one type or more than one purpose, but given the amount of time we have here, I decided to focus like a laser beam on one question, which is before and after. You see the little picture from Seaside Heights of what it looked like before the disaster and afterwards. A little photo from the U.S. Geological Survey. But what I'm going to do for you is draw a distinction between the kinds of planning we can do before a disaster hits, before we even know what that disaster is, and the kinds of planning that actually are more appropriate after we know what kind of disaster has actually struck. So we have some questions here. Is it possible to anticipate the next disaster? In most cases, yes, in the sense of understanding what are the likely kinds of disasters to hit the community, even though we don't know when. Can we plan beforehand for the recovery that follows? Well, I'm going to get into that. If so, is post-disaster planning still necessary? I'm going to answer an emphatic, of course it is. Although I have heard discussions, sometimes even inside FEMA, about people are putting too much emphasis on pre-disaster and thinking that that's going to solve all the problems. I think that's kind of a naive way of expressing it. I'm going to explain why both kinds of planning are really necessary. So does that make post-disaster planning the only game in town? Absolutely not. And why does pre-disaster planning matter? So that's our forthcoming PAS report, what we call Planning Advisory Service report out of APA. Why does it say next generation? Because it's a new iteration of something we first produced and published back in 1998, released in early 1999, called Planning for Post-Disaster Recovery and Reconstruction. Like any document in this field, 15 years old, it got long in the tooth, and several years ago I started the process of discussing with FEMA what the new version of this would look like, and it's going to be quite different from the previous one, in case any of you have actually seen the previous version. There are several things that I want to emphasize about this document before I move on. If I actually talked to you about everything that's going to be in this document, we'd be here all day, and I don't have all day. So I decided for today to focus like a laser beam on this before and after question, and I'm going to dig into that very deeply to the exclusion of everything else that is in here. But I do want you to know that this is coming out sometime late spring, probably May or June. But if you want to learn more about the project itself, you see the URL up there. You also have access through there to a Recovery News blog, which has about 3 years of information that has been piled on involving specific case studies and communities that have experienced recovery and how they've dealt with it, more general information, access to resources, a whole variety of things. So I would encourage you, because in the interest of time, this is your way to get a lot more value out of the 10 minutes I'm going to give you. And then thirdly is that model recovery ordinance, which I very much encourage you to take a look at, because I'm going to suggest that it answers some of the questions that were arising this morning about some of the things that we could do. And the purpose of the model recovery ordinance, which is a new version of one that we had in the previous document, but considerably updated, is to suggest how a community can organize the process of managing recovery by putting the procedures in place without worrying about when the next disaster is going to hit, but understanding what is going to be necessary to effectively manage recovery no matter what that disaster is. And so it goes through the process, number one, of setting up a procedure for who answers to whom and what the managerial structure for recovery management, long-term recovery management, will be. Who is going to answer to whom? Who's going to be in charge? At least the local czar, as suggested, as compared to the federal czar that was mentioned this morning. In addition, it deals with issues like how to properly handle demolitions, development moratoria, for how long do you put a hold on new development in order to do that deliberation that Rob was talking about and reassess what kinds of development you want to permit after reconstruction starts. And I'm going to mention this specifically because it answers a question that came up this morning. Lisa Brown mentioned this problem of predators scamming elderly homeowners and the like. A new feature in this version compared to 15 years ago is that Ken Topping, who worked with us on this report and developed this ordinance, added a section at my urging on contractor certification using a model developed in Cedar Rapids, Iowa after the 2008 floods. And what they wanted to do was prevent that very problem of fly-by-night contractors coming into the community and taking advantage of any number of gullible people or non-gullible people who just get simply sucked into believing somebody by forcing everyone who wanted to do repair and reconstruction work in the city to go through City Hall to get certified as qualified and trustworthy. And it's interesting, the process of forcing that to happen actually surfaced a number of contractors who had warrants out for them. It resulted in fewer arrests, interestingly enough, because some of these guys actually tried to go through the process and then, all the previous record turned up, and so it served a bit of an extra social purpose in that regard. So those things are all new features that we are bringing into this new version. But what I'm going to focus on here is one particular piece of this report in the first chapter provides a typology of recovery plans. So I want to walk you through this quickly because this gets into this. What can we do beforehand to get our community better prepared? What has to wait until afterwards? So we basically came up with a three-way typology. The first two are both pre-disaster. One we called operational because it's more limited in focus, and basically you can find the best examples of this in Florida, as some communities tried to implement a 1993 mandate in Florida planning law that required communities in coastal counties and the coastal counties themselves to have what they called post-disaster redevelopment plans built into their comprehensive plans. A post-disaster redevelopment plan in Florida law is a plan that attempts to anticipate future disasters and lay out some of the policy issues and procedural issues for how to deal with them. Now, some of these, Florida did not get around to actually issuing guidance for what these would look like for another 15 years. So in the meantime, some communities, largely relying, as often happens, on their emergency managers more than the planners, came up with some plans that were more focused on response, utility restoration, short-term kinds of recovery. And so they were less visionary, much more limited than what then materialized in a series of prototypes funded by NOAA and FEMA around 2008 to 2010, involving 5 counties and 1 municipality to really test what would make a good post-disaster redevelopment plan. Prescribing, as it says, managerial structure for recovery, identifying some of the key policy issues regardless of the type of disaster that might occur, so as to guide the kinds of planning that would then happen once you actually had a real disaster. So some of those counties were Manatee County, Hillsborough, which is the Tampa-St. Petersburg area, one city, Panama City, and a few others. Hillsborough was an interesting case because it went the farthest, I think, in terms of taking seriously the policy initiatives. We actually ran a case study that's in this new report talking about what they called priority redevelopment areas, which are essentially the areas they identify within the county that are less hazardous, safer areas to which they would aggressively steer redevelopment after a disaster as reconstruction occurred and try to move people away from the hazardous areas previously occupied. And this is really an interesting step to take. There's a lot more to that, and there's a great deal of depth in the actual plan, but at least I want to put that out there for you. And then the third type, of course, is the post-disaster. What kind of plan do you put together for recovery in the aftermath of the disaster itself? And these necessarily are based more on the physical dimensions of the actual disaster. Now you know Hurricane Sandy has hit, hurricane, whatever it is, or a flood. You know what the dimensions of the disaster have been. You know where the damaged areas are. You've done the damage assessments and you know how damaged those neighborhoods are. Then you can begin to deal with the demands of urban design and reconstruction in specific places, as opposed to having a more policy-oriented plan beforehand. Nonetheless, you are further down the road to recovery simply by having the procedure laid out, so when the disaster strikes, you've got that managerial structure in place. You know who's responsible for what, and they can move into gear instead of taking 6-8 weeks, as Louisiana did, to come up with a Louisiana Recovery Authority after Katrina, because they hadn't thought about it beforehand. Most communities have not thought about it beforehand. And this is actually the most common type of recovery plan, because I will tell you very honestly, there are relatively few communities that actually have done pre-disaster plans such as I have just described them. But there are those that I mentioned in Florida, and there are a few other examples elsewhere. And I'll get to a couple of those. So why bother with this pre-disaster policy? Why go to the effort of trying to figure out in peacetime why and how you're going to do recovery afterwards? Well, number one, it gives you the opportunity before you're in hot water to build a local culture of disaster awareness. That raises the question, why does Schwab have a picture of a goat up there on this slide? Because that is a poster from Roseville, California. The goat serves an interesting purpose. It eats the underbrush in areas, they turn these loose every summer to eat the underbrush in areas that might be subject to wildfire in order to reduce the severity or the opportunity for a wildfire, because Roseville is a suburb of Sacramento and they're up against the California hills up in the Sierra Nevada. And so it's just an element of creative mitigation. But also, it provides a focus for pre-disaster exercises. This is a chance for the leadership of the community, the people who are designated to have specific responsibilities to manage recovery after disaster, to exercise this policy, to do tabletop exercises and simulations and say, okay, suppose we have disaster X that looks like this, how would we all respond and how would we work with each other? And this is not just the planners, this is planners and public works officials, the emergency management people, hopefully the public health people, sit down around that table and talk to each other. Establish some clear lines of responsibility. I've already talked about that. Consider and review some of the financial needs. It helps greatly for a community to have surveyed and documented where the money would come from for disaster recovery before the disaster occurs, so that you're not running around like a chicken with your head cut off afterwards, trying to figure out, how do I access all this dough? You have some, your financial officials in the city have this list. Okay, this is where who provides what money for what purpose. And then a chance to assess your overall preparedness, which gets back to that culture of preparedness and the little Roseville picture there. Now, has anybody done this? Well, yeah. Actually, the history of pre-disaster policy plans kind of goes back maybe about 20 years at most, look back to the early 90s. And the best early example we have is actually one that Ken Topping, who designed this ordinance, worked on himself while in Los Angeles. He was formerly the planning director in Los Angeles back in the 1980s, early 90s, and came up with this plan, working with the city officials, to basically design a plan for post-disaster recovery before an event. It so happens that he did it, it was approved, or on the city council's agenda for approval, right about the time of the Northridge earthquake in February of 1994, which provided at least a chance to see what impact did this have. And the answer was, actually, nobody actually referred to it in dealing with the recovery, but they knew about it, they understood some of the essentials in it, but it was, it was still relatively new. What's interesting is what were some of the policy questions that were dealt with in this plan. And you can see this list here: residential, commercial, and industrial rehabilitation, restoration of public sector services, economic recovery, land use and reuse. How would you change land use patterns? Didn't turn out to be much of an issue in Northridge. Organization and authority, which I've just already described. Interesting point relating to the health discussions this morning, psychological rehabilitation. And an interesting thing, if you read the 1994 plan that was planned for Los Angeles back then, one of the things that they openly acknowledged was that, when we talk about the psychology, the psychological damage of a disaster, we tend to think about people out in the community. But that includes the city staff. Some of them are going to suffer loss of their homes. Some of them are going to suffer loss of people in their family, or injuries, or all kinds of psychological stress as a result of various problems or damaged homes. They are part of that damaged population themselves, and so to fully expect that they're going to do their job 100% under those stresses is unrealistic. And so they have to be included in that psychological rehabilitation. Vital records, big issue. Many of you already know that in New Orleans, a lot of the criminal records were lost in the basement of the police department as a result of flooding from Hurricane Katrina, and so a number of criminals were put out on the street simply because they didn't have the goods on them anymore. Issues dealing with interjurisdictional relationships. Disasters very seldom stop at the city limits, and so you have to work with your neighbors. And then issues like traffic mitigation. So what's left by the time you get to after the disaster? Well, a lot of things are still left to deal with. You've got, how are you going to use these damage assessments that you have done right after the disaster to assess the scope of what you're actually dealing with? You learn that damages can vastly exceed forecasts. Certainly this is something that Cedar Rapids learned in 2008. The previous flood of record hit about 20 feet on the river gauge at some point in the distant past. 2008, it hit 31.2 feet, more than 11 feet above the flood of record that preceded it. The situation in Japan with the earthquake and then tsunami and then nuclear crisis vastly exceeded any design disaster that they had anticipated. So this is, there are lessons to be learned at that level. Rob has already referred to this opportunity to alter development patterns. This is a big issue, not one that I have enough time to go into, but certainly one to be very much aware of. And then identify some new types of economic development potential. And that's where that picture comes from in this instance. This is a picture from Greensburg, Kansas. I was out there a couple years ago. Shot this picture. You see the windmills in the background. You see a geodesic home. Greensburg is that fabled little community in western Kansas that, for heaven only knows what reason, working through a whole series of community meetings over a period of time, came to the conclusion that it wanted to rebuild green. Put the green back in Greensburg, as the mayor says. And it was only last week, because we had these November tornadoes right before Thanksgiving in Illinois that wiped out a couple of communities, that the Chicago Tribune ran an article talking about the example from Greensburg and the example from Joplin and how it might be applied in Illinois. So these lessons travel. And one of the things that the Mayor Bob Dixon said in the article was these other communities should, quote, plan, put some deliberation into what they're doing in order to decide what kind of community they want to be when they grow up after that disaster. I can talk more about that, but it's a really critical point. Are there public health issues? Absolutely, in the post-disaster scenario. Some of these are issues that are normal peacetime issues, but because of those unique opportunities to alter the pattern of development as a part of reconstruction, there's this chance to do things more quickly than might ordinarily happen, such as connecting land use to active transportation options. You're going to rebuild a neighborhood, why not put in a hiking and biking trail or something, create a more walkable neighborhood, more mixed use that gets people a chance to walk to the store instead of driving all the time, things like that. A chance to include some relevant health goals in the planning process for post-disaster recovery. Thinking about, if you've already been thinking about access to healthy foods and drinking water, why not build it into the reconstruction process? Aligning health programs and priorities with those infrastructure decisions. And then you saw that picture of our new report. We deliberately put green infrastructure on the cover. That was actually a picture from Queens. But the opportunity to align green infrastructure with public health goals, with things like increasing physical activity, access to public parks and open spaces, all those kinds of issues, urban forestry. We have a lot of resources that we can provide on that. And then, creating some human as well as physical resilience. And at this point, for just a second, I want to tell you that we are trying to cross-fertilize a lot of these issues within APA. And I'd like to take a second to introduce a colleague who actually is sitting in the back there, Anna Ricklin, who is our manager of our Green Communities is our other center, our Planning and Community Health Research Center. So we are working in this, trying to bring these issues together as much as we can. And so there's my contact information, and with that, I will turn it over to Gavin.
Well, you're trying to do my job, James.
I ask all your questions before you think of them?
No, you're introducing Gavin. I was looking forward to it. So at least I'll say that Gavin is from the Department of City and Regional Planning, UNC Chapel Hill, so there.